Bonnie Glaser, Director of the China Power Project and Senior Advisor for Asia at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Thanks to all of our listeners for joining us. Our online event today is titled Implications of Growing U.S.-China Friction, Perspectives from East Asia. In the late 1990s, when the power gap between the United States and China was still very wide, then Chinese President Jiang Zemin and U.S. President Bill Clinton agreed to pursue a constructive strategic partnership. And 2 decades later, in 2017, the Trump administration issued a national security strategy that called China a strategic rival and a revisionist power. The transformation of the bilateral U.S.-China relationship from cooperation to strategic competition was gradual, but in many ways inescapable. The main drivers have been China's emergence as an economic power and with stronger military capabilities, the resulting U.S. perception of a challenge to its primacy in Asia and to the rules-based international order, Xi Jinping's rise to power, and the policies he has pursued, including the reversal of economic reforms and the implementation of industrial policies aimed at dominating crucial 21st century dual-use technologies. And, of course, the Trump administration's more aggressive push to even the playing field and to push back against perceived threats to the interests of the United States and its allies. Whereas in the past, Beijing and Washington have worked together to respond to global challenges, such as the 2008 global financial crisis and climate change, the COVID-19 pandemic has not been a catalyst for greater cooperation. Instead, it has led to acrimony and mistrust. A blame game is underway over where and how the virus started, and whether China's initial failure to share information hampered the ability of the United States and other countries to respond to the outbreak when it hit their countries. Intensifying U.S.-China strategic competition is impacting regional and global politics. Today, we are going to discuss the effects on power dynamics and politics in East Asia. So we are delighted to have with us 3 outstanding experts. Joining us from Canberra, Australia, is Rory Medcalf. He's head of the National Security College at the Australian National University. His career includes stints as a diplomat, journalist, an intelligence analyst, and a think tank expert. And he has a new book that's titled Contest for the Indo-Pacific, Why China Won't Map the Future. We're also delighted to have with us Sheila Smith, Senior Fellow for Japan Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C. She's also an adjunct professor in the Asian Studies Department at Georgetown University. And her most recent book is Japan Rearmed, the Politics of Military Power. And from Sydney, Australia, we are pleased to have Ben Bland, Director of the Southeast Asia Program at the Lowy Institute. And before joining Lowy, Ben was an award-winning journalist, foreign correspondent for the Financial Times. He had postings in Hanoi and Jakarta and Hong Kong, and published a book titled Generation HK, Seeking Identity in China's Shadow. So I'm going to pose a few questions to our speakers, one at a time, and then after 2 rounds of responses, we will take questions from our online audience. To ask a question at any point, please go to csis.org, click on the green button on the CSIS event page that is labeled Ask Live Questions Here, and that will take you to a simple Google form where you can fill out your name, your affiliation, and your question. And then I will pick out a handful of submitted questions to ask our speakers during the Q&A period. So I'm going to start with our first question for our distinguished speakers, and I'm going to go to you first, Rory. How does the region and specific countries, maybe you can talk from the Australian perspective or other US allies, how does the region that you closely, countries you closely follow, view growing US-China strategic competition? What impact was this growing US-China rivalry having before the onset of COVID-19.
Thanks, Bonnie, and it's a real pleasure to join you all. Indeed, I appreciate your mentioning my book as well, because in fact, in other circumstances, I would have been in the United States this week speaking and promoting that book. So I will share with our viewers the US edition of the book, different title, same book, that I would have been promoting this week. And I share that partly because I wanted to, I think in answering your question, start with a little snapshot of the world pre-COVID, which already I think many of us are struggling to remember. But I think it's important to note, as you say, that pretty profound US-China strategic competition was already well underway before this coronavirus shock this year. And as my book argues, a lot of the other players in the Indo-Pacific region, and I'd note particularly not only US allies such as Australia and Japan, which we'll hear about more from Sheila in a moment, but also others, particularly India, to some extent some of the Southeast Asians, Vietnam, for example. There were many countries in the region that at one level were, I think, appreciative of the fact that the United States was attempting to set some limits to Chinese power and influence, and I guess pushing back against what had been appeared to be something of a free run for the PRC over a number of years, where its privileging of its own interests in the South China Sea or in other domains was really infringing on the sovereignty and self-respect of other nations. The challenge for all of us in the region, and it is very hard to generalize about the region, so I'm a bit wary of that, but the challenge for all of us was that, of course, we wanted a degree of managed strategic competition between the US and China. We wanted in some ways to frankly, to help an assertive and powerful and increasingly almost totalitarian, in fact, China, find a kind of strategic settling point in the region where it would begin to again respect the interests and rights of other powers. And to achieve that managed settling point, there needs to be a degree of cooperation and an overall atmosphere of coexistence. And of course, with the approach that particularly the Trump administration had been taking in recent years, I'm not sure we were headed for that, I guess, hybrid competition and cooperation. And of course, the coronavirus situation now has swung the pendulum even further. So it just looks, from where I sit, extraordinarily difficult now to find that balance, to find that settling point. And in the meantime, and I'll pause on this point, many of the other powers in the region, and I include Australia in that list, although we are, I think, deeply, speak informally here, deeply disturbed by particularly the cover-up and the suppression of truth that within the PRC really drove this global pandemic. At the same time, an atmosphere of unlimited competition with China is not going to get the region or the world through this crisis. That's a very broad generalisation, and country by country, if we have time, we can go into that. Deep mistrust of, even more profound mistrust of China now than a year ago, but at the same time, really great anxiety when we look to the question of whether the Trump administration is capable of steering not only the United States, but helping to navigate the region through this crisis.
Good. That gets us off to a great start. Let me turn to Sheila Smith. And Sheila, can you talk about how Japan was viewing US-China strategic competition before COVID hit, and how Prime Minister Abe was managing that strategic competition and what impact it was having on the region from Japan's perspective?
Absolutely, Bonnie. I'd be delighted to. And thank you for having me. And also, it's great to be with our Australian colleagues at the other side of the world. You'll see the sun setting on those of us here in DC. And so, but I appreciate our Australian colleagues getting up so early. So the strategic rivalry between the United States and China is something that Japan has not largely anticipated, but Japan, of course, had its own strategic rivalry emerge into some pretty significant tensions in almost a decade ago in 2010, when you had a small incident in the East China Sea between a Chinese fishing captain and Japanese Coast Guard that then very quickly escalated into a global diplomatic shout out, so to speak, at the UN, and some very serious military pressure in the East China Sea between both the Chinese and the Japanese. That, of course, put pressure on the US-Japan alliance to adjust itself to try to figure out how to continue to provide deterrence against any kind of military threat against Japan. So Japan and you referenced at the beginning, South Korea, these are our two allies in Northeast Asia, to which the United States is obligated to provide defensive assistance if necessary, but also the United States' role there is very important for the security of both of these non-nuclear powers, right? So as the strategic rivalry has intensified, to a certain extent, policymakers in Tokyo were somewhat relieved that the United States was giving due attention now to the strategic challenge that China was posing in the region. I think the new national defense strategy set many defense or military policymakers' minds at ease in Tokyo, because it committed the United States to paying attention to the Asia Pacific in a far deeper way than I think they had worried that the United States may not have been paying close attention to prior to that. So I think in some ways it was relief, but I think the larger picture, to take a step back from the immediacy of the Japan-China tensions in the East China Sea, the larger question is really how to manage the region, not just Japan's own security and defenses, but also how to manage the regional institutions that were built for collaboration across what we now refer to as the Indo-Pacific, how to make sure that other partners of Japan, Australia, for example, India and the Southeast Asian maritime countries would be able to work collectively together. And Japan has largely taken a much more engaged role in working with other partners in the region. But of course, this was the umbrella for this was really the American active engagement in also trying to underpin some collective response. When China would push, there would be a collective response backwards, whether it was maritime or other issues. So Washington has always been critical to Japan's ability, I think, to garner regional support, especially in the military realm. Abe has come back into power, quite acutely aware of Japan's handicaps. And so to remind our listeners, he came back into power in December 2012. He has now been the longest serving Japanese prime minister. That has allowed him and his party, which has a 2/3 majority in the parliament, to enact a host of security policy reforms that allows Japan to play this larger role with other partners. Yet we were just on the cusp as we came into 2020, just on the cusp of a pretty significant breakthrough in Japan-China diplomatic ties. There's been some high-level summitry, and it's taken a long time to get here. So there was a great sort of sense of anticipation that President Xi was going to visit Tokyo. And at that moment, Xi and Abe would be able to come to some kind of mutual strategic understanding of how they could work together in the future. So the COVID-19 virus emerged just in time to offset or put that diplomatic path off kilter. I think there's two tensions here. We can talk more about it in some detail, but I think the tension for Tokyo is it needs the strong strategic partnership with the United States for its own security and well-being. But it also doesn't want full-on strategic rivalry between Washington and Beijing, because that would limit Japan's options. It would increase risk, obviously, and it would force Japan, I think, to take some hard decisions. If the strategic rivalry became too overt or too militarized, it would put Japan in a very delicate position. I think it's important to remember both South Korea and Japan are very proximate to China. They are fully within military range of the PLA. They feel this very up close and personal, and it has real ramifications for Japan's future choices. So Washington is critical to the Japan strategy of managing this rise. And I'm not sure how much leverage Tokyo feels it has at the moment. Prime Minister Abe in particular feels he has with the current president of the United States, who is not always a predictable partner, even though the US-Japan alliance has been reasonably stable compared to other alliances in the region and beyond. So I think there's opportunity and risk here for Japan in the strategic rivalry between the two countries. And I think this COVID-19 has exacerbated some of the risk elements of that from Tokyo's perspective.
Great. Well, now let's turn to Ben to talk about Southeast Asia. Obviously, 10 different countries all have, to some extent, different perspectives, but I think there's some common themes there that I hope you'll bring out for us. These are countries that have important economic relationships, obviously, with China. And just as Sheila said, that Japan and South Korea are within range of the PLA's military capabilities. Obviously, Southeast Asian countries are, and those that are claimants have to deal with the constant presence in their waters, in their exclusive economic zones of China's Coast Guard ships. And we've been seeing, obviously, a lot of activity there. So how did these Southeast Asian countries view, before the onset of COVID, the growing US-China strategic competition?
Great to be with you all. As you said, Bonnie, Southeast Asia is a really diverse region. We've got all sorts of governments and economies, from communist dictatorships in Vietnam and Laos, military systems in Thailand and Myanmar, problematic democracies in the Philippines and in Indonesia. But I'll try and make three general points. The first would be, we've been talking about Chinese power, not only your project, but all of us, for a long time. But really in the last few years for Southeast Asian nations, sort of the imminence of China has become really clear, and also the increasing dominance, maybe not hegemonic yet, but certainly the dominance economically, politically, and as you alluded to, militarily, right? We've seen the construction of these Chinese military bases on contested reefs in the South China Sea. I think that's really changed the kind of mental map for particularly the claimant states in the South China Sea, the likes of Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia, and others. And it's also a really strong demonstration of the hard power, but also economically, we've seen Chinese investment, Chinese loans to many of the countries in Southeast Asia increasing really dramatically in the last few years. So that Chinese power has gone from kind of a fear or a concern to a reality. That's the first point. Secondly, I think when it comes to the US, there's kind of a great ambivalence, if you like, across the region. It obviously differs country by country. But broadly, on the one hand, I think there's obviously an irritation, as you can imagine, with the Trump administration and the way it's handled the region. On the one hand, there's been this kind of haranguing, bullying tone, especially over issues like the use of Huawei in 5G networks, which to Southeast Asian countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, it's a cheap form of technology. Huawei is a company employing a lot of people. And, officials in these countries are being criticized by their US counterparts for doing something without being offered an alternative. It's very similar in the pressures that countries have faced over taking Belt and Road projects, a similar frustration. But on the other hand, there's a fear of US abandonment. And we see that in the kind of the anger over a lack of a high-level presence at the East Asia Summit, really the premier forum for Southeast Asian nations to engage with the rest of the region. I think there was only a US national security advisor sent this last time, not even anyone above that level, even at the Secretary of State level. So there's a fear of abandonment at the same time as a fear of being pushed around by the US, which is quite strange. And we see in survey data, actually, that for the first time this year, Southeast Asian foreign policy elites believe that China is strategically dominant in the region more than the US. But at the same time, they still see the US in a way as a partner of choice. And also key US partners and allies like the EU and Japan are equally high up there in the partners that Southeast Asian countries want to be working with economically and politically. So it's not game over for the US. But the third point I'd make, bringing that together, is I think there's a real risk of complacency in Washington, in Canberra too, and in the Western world, that somehow China will end up upsetting the apple cart in Southeast Asia. It will annoy countries, and in a way, the West will come out on top by default. But I think it's a mistaken view, because for many of the different countries of the region, they're dealing with deep domestic crises. Their leaders are looking to boost their economies. And the key source of cash for the foreseeable future, easy cash, is going to be coming from China. I think that's the first point. But secondly, I don't really think there is this coalition of the willing that some analysts like to see. Japan and Korea, as Sheila mentioned, spend as much time fighting with each other as they do agreeing with each other about what to do about China. I think it's the same when you look across Southeast Asia, and we tend to see what we want to see. Vietnam, for example, likes to balance for sure, and we like to hear the nice things that Vietnam says about accepting US ships to come and visit and working to uphold the rules-based order. But we don't spend so much time focusing on how the Vietnamese Communist Party and the Chinese Communist Party talk about being as close as lips and teeth and communist brothers, defending the party state from hostile forces out there in the Western world. So I think there's a real danger that if we see things only through this lens of US-China competition, we think kind of people are more on our side than they really are. And it's really quite a complicated picture.
Great. Well, let's now turn to the topic of the actual impact of COVID-19. And if you could address, how has the pandemic influenced the perceptions of Asian countries toward the US and China? How has it affected regional politics? And then looking out a little bit more into the future, the next few years or so, how do you think the pandemic will shape the region and global politics? Is it going to be a very significant factor? Is it going to change power dynamics and perceptions in the region? Or will we be here a year from now, perhaps having an effective vaccine, everybody back to work, and find that nothing much really has changed, which is an argument which Tufts University Professor Dan Dresner has put forward in one of his articles, somewhat controversially, because I think a lot of other people are saying this is going to be a game changer. So let's do a quick round. Rory, over to you.
Look, thanks. That's the big one, and I'm a little bit reluctant because I think everyone's leaping out at the moment with their grand prognostication for the world after coronavirus, and we're suddenly all pandemic experts overnight, which of course we're not. So I'm a bit wary on this, but I would tend to say that it is a very powerful moment of change. It may well be a moment of acceleration of certain trends. I think, however, we also have to be very wary of the parochialism of the present and assume that whatever disruption this brings over the next year or two or three, because I do think this is going to be more than a 12-month emergency, I guess, for the world, regardless of when a vaccine actually, when or whether a vaccine is actually on the horizon. If we still play a long game in the region and globally around the story of Chinese power, and by a long game, I mean 20 to 25 years, which I guess is a pretty short time horizon in some Chinese government thinking. The answer is that this will not necessarily transform the power balance in the world. I think the argument that somehow Chinese dominance is being cemented by this crisis, I think, is overblown. The choices that countries make in the next in the months and the year ahead are going to be very important. And of course, many of us are looking to the way the United States is or is not handling the problem, because that does give us a pointer as to where the US will go. But I think even if somehow the Dresner thesis holds true, and a year or two from now the region looks not dissimilar to where it is, the perceptions of populations will have changed really quite dramatically, of elites in particular. So, for example, the flavour of the month at the moment in Australia is thinking again about a much higher degree of economic self-reliance. Now, that's an extraordinary conversation to be having in such a trade-dependent economy, and such an economy that has a pretty poor history of its own manufacturing base. But these kind of, in some ways, very 20th or even 19th century conversations are happening in every country pretty much around the world, accelerating the debate of how economically reliant will we be becoming on China. So I would say that even if we break through this current situation, you're going to see a much stronger national security mindset, very broadly, including geoeconomics and economic security and supply chain security in many countries. I think you'll see this in parts of Europe as well. You're certainly seeing this in India, where it was always part of the conversation as well. And of course, we're even seeing, as we may come to with Sheila, an acceleration of Japan's disinvestment from China. So I would say that regardless of how ragged the American performance is in the response at the moment, and we're all looking at the human toll, quite very, very disturbed from this side of the Pacific. Nonetheless, I don't think China is suddenly going to be able to use this crisis to assert any kind of moral or geoeconomic leadership in the region. It will continue to be uneven. The thesis of my book, which went to print in January, when I suspect not even everyone in the Chinese leadership knew exactly what was going on with coronavirus, is that there still is going to be a lot of, if you like, self-harm in China's, neo-colonial behaviour across the Indo-Pacific, and indeed the extraordinary scenes we've seen this week of Africa pushing back against some pretty racist behaviour inside China is a reminder of how hard it's going to be for China to assert itself right across this Indo-Pacific region. So look, an even messier playing board a year or two from now, and I would not assume that the middle players, Australia, India, Japan, Southeast Asians, Europeans, are going to somehow magically be out of the game when all this is over.
Great, excellent points. So Sheila, how has COVID-19 affected Japan's view? And Rory just mentioned, of course, Japan's own reconsideration of shifting supply chains, and Japan's now announced apparently that it's going to create a fund to try and incentivize Japanese companies to move some of their manufacturing elsewhere, which is something the United States has not done. We've talked up a good game, but not actually put our money where our mouth is. So if you can look in your crystal ball and let us know where you think things will be in a few years and how important the COVID-19 factor is going to be. Over to you.
Thank you, Bonnie. So yeah, I'll pick up on the economic first, and I think there's two things for Japan that are pretty critical here that'll affect not only Japan's relationship with China, but with us, and also the way it looks at the region. So let me start with the economic side, because I think we've got some numbers now coming out of on the economic side for Japan. They're pretty interesting. Just to remind people, Japan today has somewhere in the vicinity of 8,000 cases of people confirmed. And to put that in perspective, beginning of the week, it was closer to 5, right? 30% of that number is in Tokyo. Now it's expanding in the Osaka metropolitan area. So Japan's early response to COVID-19 was a sort of similar to South Korea without the massive systemic testing. And it thought it had it under control. Clearly, it's starting to look a little bit more like some of the European countries look, and perhaps, hopefully, not as bad as us. But so Japan is now in the throes of trying to figure out where it is. But what you know in terms of the economic impact on Japan, it's pretty clear. The trend lines are clear. So tourism was a big part of Japanese economic growth. Tourism dropped by 58% in February when the restrictions on tourists, and those were primarily tourists from China. So that's one piece. The second piece is by the mid to late February, an informal study done on Japanese companies invested in China. There's about 2,600 companies. About 37% of those companies asked to be given assistance in leaving the China market to go back to Japan. So when Prime Minister Abe announced his stimulus package earlier in the week, over 108 trillion yen, or somewhere over a little bit over $1 trillion. It's about 20% of the size of the Japanese economy, for those of you who pay attention. Pretty significant. $2.2 billion of that was to assist Japanese companies to come home. There was another, 200, or 2 billion rather, another 200,000, 200 million, sorry, you can't get my yen and dollars straight in my mind. $200 million was to relocate elsewhere. But the bulk of Japanese manufacturers in China expressed a desire to go home to the Japanese market. So the sense of not only political risk in the Japan-China relationship, right, but also the sense that economic risk on the private sector, the evaluation of economic risk has gone up significantly. It's interesting, Abe provided that in the stimulus. I think that was a pretty interesting signal to Beijing, right, of the costs to not treating this virus in the way that I think many in Japan thought that the Chinese should have treated it. That being said, I think the longer term question for Japan, of course, is how it's going to resuscitate its economy generally. And it came out of 2019 with a pretty sluggish economic growth rate, and it's going to be struggling for some time. So I think the question here is, can Japan afford to pull up the drawbridge to nationalize all its manufacturing? It can't afford to do it suddenly. So there will have to be some measured thinking beyond this stimulus package about how Japan might reorganize its manufacturing to be less susceptible to the supply chain, especially the supply chain dynamics in China, but it may be broader than just China. The second area where Japan, I think, is going to be watching very closely Chinese behavior, but also ours, right, is that the demand for global leadership and collective action that the COVID-19 has revealed, the demand is urgent, and it is the lack of it is going to affect lives, not only in here in the United States or in Japan, in China, but everywhere. And so the social instability piece of this going forward is something I think Japan is going to be very seriously concerned about. So, drawing up the drawbridge economically, lack of global collective action on a problem that can't be solved at the national level alone, right? Both of those things run sort of counter to the way that Japan has dealt with both not only global health, but its own role in the world. Japan sees itself as a global player. It sees international collaboration as the best way forward to enhance human security. So this is also running counter to Japanese interests and preferences in terms of how it engages with the world.
Great. Okay, Ben, from Southeast Asia, COVID-19, has it had an impact? Does it matter? And what will be the long-term impact?
Well, I'll start with the requisite disclaimer that I know it feels like we've been in this crisis for 4 years, but it's not even 4 months since the first outbreaks in China. And in most of our countries and in a lot of Southeast Asia, it's really only the last month or even the last few weeks where things have accelerated. So it's so early. But I think I'd start in terms of US-China competition by agreeing, I think, broadly with Rory that the overall power dynamics probably haven't really shifted yet and maybe won't shift that much. Of course, China has had this charm offensive in Southeast Asia. They've sent some very small medical teams to the likes of Laos, Cambodia, Philippines, Thailand. They've sent some medical assistant masks and the like and testing equipment, not all of which has worked, like elsewhere, to Indonesia and Malaysia, Thailand. But it's pretty small. And I must say, at the same time, the US government through USAID has given, I think, $18 million in aid to Southeast Asian countries with a lot less fanfare. That may actually be more financial assistance than the Chinese, but it's still pretty small on both sides. So I think probably not that much shifts there in the end. When it comes to how it changes the politics of Southeast Asia, this is a really interesting question because there was already a concern about a kind of resurgent authoritarianism in the region. There's only really a couple of democracies in Southeast Asia, and even they are really struggling with this sort of deep historic battle between democracy and more draconian authoritarian rule. And I think inevitably we've seen, even in the early few weeks of this crisis, governments look to enhance their emergency powers. We've seen governments which almost all have deep connections to the military securitizing the problem, so putting military figures front and center. launching information wars, arresting people for criticizing the government. We've seen, President Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines, Hun Sen in Cambodia bringing in emergency laws, giving themselves extra powers. Even in Indonesia, dozens of people have been arrested or prosecuted for criticizing the government over their pretty terrible handling of the crisis. So I think there's a sort of resurgence of authoritarianism. That doesn't necessarily mean that governments will be effective at handling the problem, and perhaps the contrary. And this is the big challenge, I think, for Indonesia, the region's largest country. They're seeing a real sharp increase in both cases and deaths, despite one of the lowest testing rates in the world. And I think it's a real concern of whether Indonesia can even keep on top of this crisis or not. That's the immediate concern, not necessarily how it changes the wider politics of the region. Obviously, ASEAN, the regional body, has had a couple of meetings, including one this week, about this issue. And as usual, it's proven itself to be both indispensable but inadequate at the same time. It's really not set up to deal with a crisis like this. And I think that brings me on to my last point about the world, that I think, as Sheila was alluding to, there's a paradox here that we've seen that COVID-19 shows us that we need global institutions like the WHO, the UN more than ever. But the flip side is that we've all responded, not just Trump's America, we've all responded with these unilateral approaches of putting up borders, hoarding equipment, personally and as countries too. So I think there's a real paradox there, and that leads me to question what our bigger response will be. I think it's inevitable that countries across the world will look to maybe focus on the national security elements of their economy, and they need stockpiles of antibiotics, of key medicines, of masks and other protective equipment. But I would wonder how far we can really rejig global supply chains at the end of the day. Does Australia really want to start producing a national car again? It just closed its last factory that was doing that. I think it's unlikely. Are we going to see Japan and other countries want to start making more smartphones and microwaves and fridges and kitchen furniture? I think it's quite unlikely. So we're going to see some adjustments, but maybe not as much on the economic front as people think.
Great. Well, we're now going to use the remaining 20 minutes that we have to respond to some of the questions that have been coming in from listeners. I'm going to start with a question from Chris Gragg from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and because it really goes, it's a good segue from some of the things we've been talking about. Japan's $2.2 billion for moving manufacturing out of China. And then also he referenced Australia's investment reviews. So the question is, in response to COVID and these policies to further decouple economic ties with China, do you expect to see more of this? Do you think that other countries are going to get on board? And ultimately, so Ben, you're rather pessimistic. The supply chains are actually going to really be moved to other countries. I'd like to ask Rory and Sheila whether they think this is really going to have much of an impact. And maybe it's not right to think about the complete decoupling of the US and Chinese economies. I don't think anybody thinks that we're going to stop trading, but will there be other areas, is like pharmaceuticals and medical, and now, of course, is now being added to telecoms. Are there going to be other areas that countries are going to want to label national security and bring the manufacturing of items back home, or to countries that are more like-minded and more reliable, so that they won't put their security at risk in the future? So who would like to start with that?
I can jump in if you like, briefly, Bonnie. Look, I think there is a live debate developing in Australia on this, and I think you'll see some interesting alliances forming internally on, for example, among manufacturers and trade unions and so on, and politicians from left and right on these issues. But I would say that the end result is likely to be quite selective. So, I mean, Ben, I think you can be pretty assured that Australia won't be building cars again for a while. But at the same time, the impetus that was already there to develop much more of a national security and defence-oriented manufacturing base in Australia, that will continue. The diversification of supply chains, I think, is the key point to emphasise here. Not just a blanket withdrawal of any economic ties with China. I think there's some nervousness, frankly, about some of the aspects of the reliability of the Australia-US economic relationship too. I mean, it's quite strange that the Australian government's response to our fuel insecurity in recent years was to look to the American oil reserve to support us, whereas perhaps we need to simply diversify our energy supply, full stop. So I think it will be selective, and I think it will be more of an emphasis on diversification rather than simply shutting down borders. But I do think that there's a diplomatic opportunity here to build some of those new coalitions that we all talk about. So, for example, why shouldn't Australia and Japan be having a much closer conversation about critical technologies? Why shouldn't we be looking again to, I guess, how if, for example, Japan or indeed Taiwan are able to address their own manufacturing strengths and their own traditional strengths, why can't economies like Australia engage more closely with them? So I think it's the beginning of a journey. I'd also note that some trends that were apparent before COVID, for example, the anxiety particularly about Chinese telecommunications firms, Huawei in particular, in Australia and other parts of the world, I suspect those are going to intensify. Right now, we're all living online. So we're all putting all of our communications potentially in the hands of actors that we simply don't know. And so I think even at a citizen's level now, there's going to be a greater awareness of cybersecurity. And all of this is going to be looked at, I suspect, by governments in this both national security approach and diversification of supply chains.
Anyone else want to jump in on this, or should we move on?
Yeah, let me say a couple of things quickly, especially from the position of Japan. I think the hollowing out of the Japanese labor force has been going on now for some time, and so lots of Japanese manufacturers are global companies. We all know them. They're autos, they're consumer goods, etc. Right? So there has also been a desire to have more job creation inside Japan. It has never, the profitability of that has never been appealing to some of Japanese manufacturers. They have better profitability offshore. But I think, so some of that might change because it'll be politically more salient now. But I think one of the things that we can't really, one of the questions about COVID-19, and especially about the pull up the drawbridge kind of reaction of everybody, right, is where is it safe? Right? I mean, it raises this interesting question about the rationality or the economic rationality of the global supply chain may be one thing, but the perception of economic and political risk and now health risk, I think may change private actors' calculations in ways that we can't yet foresee. So it's not just the national government's response. I think private actors are going to be a little bit more cautious. And we're all talking as if there's a rational policy response to this. And I'll just throw this out there for the sake of throwing it out there. Rationality has been in short supply in some moments, especially if you're sitting here in the United States. Science and politics have not aligned. I think if you could put it that way, always in our response, the United States response. I think that's maybe true in other countries as well. And it's likely true across all of our responses, which is why we see this kind of panicky response. I'm not sure we're going to get rational outcomes. And I'm not sure we're going to get fully rational strategic thought coming out of the other side of COVID-19. But I bet you this, and I'm sure all of us probably feel the same way, medical supplies, masks, PPEs, all the things necessary to deal with pandemics, I think will now be will be seen as a national security need. And I think citizens are going to demand it. that we ought to be able to respond should we have to confront this in a similar way going forward.
Great. Ben, I have a specific question for you. It comes from Adam Schwartz from Asia Group Advisors. And his question is, how might the global push for greater economic self-reliance and shorter supply chains impact Southeast Asia and its relations with China and the United States?
Well, I think some countries in Southeast Asia will continue to see an opportunity in winning manufacturing business that's been leaving China over the last 5 or 10 years, broadly for financial reasons, right? I used to cover manufacturing in China, and the wages in Guangdong were rising really rapidly over the last decade. China also has an aging population, so it doesn't necessarily, it's not going to have the workforce it had in the past. So we've seen Japanese and Chinese manufacturers and Western manufacturers shifting at the margins production into places like Vietnam, Cambodia, Myanmar to an extent where the wages are significantly lower. So, this could be an opportunity for some of those countries to pick up a bit more manufacturing business, although you'd have to question whether those countries are really better prepared than China to deal with a future pandemic. So I think there's some opportunities at the margins, but I don't think it changes the economics too much for most Southeast Asian countries. For almost all of them, China is one of their biggest trading partners, and it's the biggest kind of expected source of future investment. If you look at the stock of existing investment, European companies and US companies and the Japanese are really high up there. But the expectation is that most of the easier money to come in the years ahead will be from China. And obviously there'll be an impact on the Chinese economy from everyone from the coronavirus. But I expect that China will continue to be a really important source of investment, and that we will see Southeast Asian countries sort of plugging bit by bit more into kind of Chinese supply chains, winning some business, but that still being part of this China-focused supply chain system. It's not as if when you move a mobile phone parts factory from Guangdong to Hanoi, that you're breaking up the supply chain. That's actually just sort of extending it into Vietnam. So I think we'll see that continue. I don't expect we'll see a massive restructuring.
So I have a question from Bates Gill, my former colleague at CSIS, now at Macquarie University and the Royal United Services Institute. And he essentially thinks that there's going to be a bifurcation of countries, one group that has achieved pretty much success in managing the spread of the virus, countries like Australia, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and then countries that have not dealt so well with the virus, European states, the United States, and probably India. And so he asked, will it be easier for the former states that have done well to re-engage with China, but less easy for those that have been heavily afflicted with China? And so is there a consequence in terms of maybe Chinese leverage influence that it has over these states in the future? That last question, that last sentence was just mine added on. Maybe Rory, if you could jump in here.
Nice to hear from you, Bates. Look, that's a great argument. It's possibly a little bit too elegant. The way I'd address that question that's really got me thinking, though, is that even though there may well be these players that are coping better at the moment and may cope better through this, and I think Australia is doing very well in flattening the curve, as they say. However, we still don't know how bad the economic pain is going to be. But even as we come through this, I think that those countries that have coped better are not necessarily going to want to re-engage with China in the same way. And interestingly, I think this experience is going to change certainly from an Australian perspective, I think our perspective on what matters in terms of our economic vulnerability in dealing with China. So as many of the watchers of this discussion will know, big debate in Australia in recent years has been, can we afford to hurt China's feelings diplomatically when, for example, our education and tourism sectors are so incredibly vulnerable to even the slightest hint of Chinese economic coercion, pressure and pain? Well, China has now perhaps, well, certainly I would argue inadvertently, China has now inadvertently devastated for the time being our tourism and economic and education sectors through the failure to warn of or sufficiently or contain the pandemic. So in that sense, we've already experienced the kind of pain in extremis that we anticipated we would feel if ever we hurt China's feelings diplomatically. That's going to build over time, I think, an interesting sense of almost resilience in these sectors into the future, because I suspect there's going to be less desire ever again to make those or any other parts of our economy dependent on one single power. So I would suggest that countries that get through this reasonably well, yes, they may have an advantage in re-engaging early with China or any other actor, but they're going to have an even greater incentive towards that diversification. I think it is still definitely too early to tell how the others will cope, and I think India is a huge question mark. But I think into the long term, I think even the South Asian countries will in time bounce back, particularly because they have such young populations, where the democracy in those countries will come back in a healthy way is an entirely different question. Whether those countries will have any sense of trust of China in a post-COVID world is another question again, and I suspect that trust will be even further diminished.
I might just disagree slightly with Rory there to spice up the conversation. I mean, what I've seen in Southeast Asia since the outbreak of this crisis is actually a lot of deference to China. You know, we've seen elsewhere in the world, obviously in the US, in the UK too, a bit of it recently, sort of the blame game, you know, an effort, a narrative effort to sort of pin the blame on China and deflect from domestic frailties. But in Southeast Asia, we've seen deference. So very early on, there was this China-ASEAN summit when the ASEAN foreign ministers met up actually in person back in the days when those things used to happen. They didn't shake hands, but they did meet, and that was basically a visual show of support that the ASEAN would stand with China. Now, of course, it's sort of almost the other way around, and it's not that people think China has necessarily handled it amazingly, but it's the same deference they had before is still there. And I don't think that Indonesia and the like will necessarily come out of this in a place where they're confident enough to do anything in terms of sort of managing great power relations or even focus on those issues. I think they're going to be handling the domestic health and economic effects of this for a long, long time to come.
Very interesting. Sheila, you wanted to jump in and leave me time to ask one more question.
Okay, I'll just be very brief to Bates's question. I think that bifurcation of countries into the ones who've done well and the ones who haven't suggests that COVID-19 is going to change the underlying geostrategic or calculus here, and I don't buy that. So I think the bifurcation is not necessarily the key. The obvious place to look at that is Taiwan. Taiwan has been a great success. I think there's competition now to demonstrate Taiwan's prowess that may or may not affect its relationship with Beijing. And Bonnie, I'll defer to you on that. But it's not the same as Japan, for example. South Korea, we've just had an election in South Korea. I think one of the relationships that I think is very interesting, even in the successful countries, is going to be the relationship between the citizens and their government in the democracies. And so here you see a great outpouring of voter participation in a South Korean election, a very strong endorsement of the Moon Jae-in and his party. So I think it's redounded well for democracy in South Korea, but also obviously it's a mark of citizen confidence in the competency of their government. I think you're seeing the opposite here in the United States. Look at Michigan, for example. The governor is trying to get people to stay at home, and we've just had demonstrations with people who say, you can't make me stay home, and protesting with their guns. So there's it's not the country to country relationship. I think what's going to be fascinating and as an intellectual kind of exercise to watch is that demand for competency on the part of citizens. and how that translates into confidence in democracy going forward. You could see two different ways in our November election. You could stretch this out to Brazil and other countries, right? Japan. Not sure how the Japanese public is going to evaluate Mr. Abe's competency, because we don't know yet where the success or failure of the Japanese approach is going to lead him in terms of his political legacy. So I think there's a story here, but Bates, I would just say it's not country to country or basket to basket, but it's going to be the citizen to state piece, where that competency really matters in terms of people's lives, where I think democracy is really going to be under a microscope.
Okay, we only have a few minutes left, but I did want to try to work in one more question, so maybe you can just have a couple of very quick answers. And this is from Lance Corporal Terrell from the U.S. Marine Corps. It's a very specific military-focused question. Do you think that China is going to use COVID-19 as a pretext to increase travel regulations through the South China Sea? Could you see China using the disease to prevent ships such as the U.S. Theodore Roosevelt, our aircraft carrier, from transiting what it views as its territorial waters? Now, China, of course, has not said that all of the South China Sea is its territorial waters, but it is trying to exert greater control over those waters. So let me turn to you, Rory, and there's also sort of an interesting question at play here as to whether China is going to try to seek military advantage, even possibly use military force. Some people have raised the question that this would increase the potential for China to use force against Taiwan, which I myself am rather skeptical of. But do you think that any of this makes sense, or are we not going to see China take advantage of COVID-19 in those ways, but will rather focus on portraying itself as the global provider of public goods?
So look, I think that's that South China Sea idea, again, it's a fascinating idea, and I hope they're not listening, because but seriously, I think I don't think there's going to be a fundamental change to the risk calculus that the PRC uses in its military deployments, or if it's Indo-Pacific, if you like, military footprint. We're seeing China push into the Indian Ocean. We're seeing interesting activity in the Pacific. We're seeing the assertiveness in the South China Sea and the East China Sea in the similar patterns, I think, to recent years. I don't see a fundamental change, and I think there's actually frankly, I think it would be extremely foolish for China to somehow use the current prolonged crisis as an opportunity to step up its coercion at sea, because we still don't know how well China is actually doing in managing this situation at home, managing the long-term political fallout from the early disaster of coronavirus, and just adding the fog of uncertainty that any military action would bring into that mix could still be, I think, extremely harmful for stability in China, and I suspect the Chinese leadership understand that.
I wanted to just give you a minute, Ben, maybe to give your perspective, since reporters are certainly asking me whether the COVID-19 is responsible for the recent aggressiveness by the Chinese, which, of course, there was this alleged incident of a sinking of a